So anyway, so my sense is that just to review a little bit, and obviously if there are any questions or strands that we want to pick up, my sense is the first time, the focus for me anyway was Ratzinger before the Second Vatican Council. And what I wanted to what I hope I was highlighting was there's an element of just German society and culture that he grew up in. I think sometimes Seewald, in dealing with him and in the biography, Seewald will gesture towards it. But I think it's probably, some of these things were more, like for example, the Hunger Years, towards the end and at the end of the Second World War, where Ratzinger at one point will say, well, in the seminary, we really didn't suffer through that. Right? But it was so big that Cardinal Frings, right, he pronounced, we're in the state of the universal destination of goods. Right? In other words, where you can, if you see food, you can get it, you can take it. And the other thing I think that's significant are, I think there is a kind of similar, I think there's a parallel between the United States in the 1950s and Germany in the 1950s with respect to some of these cultural battles, right? And how the church was engaging in these cultural battles. So I'm blanking right now on the name of the German institution, but in the United States it was the Legion of Decency. So, and just briefly to review that so in the 1930s, right? Apparently in the late 20s and early 30s, Hollywood movies were getting really bad as far as presentation of morality. And so the church established the Legion of Decency. And so Catholics, one day a year, Catholics at Mass, after the homily, they would make a pledge. They would put up their right hands and they would make a pledge that they would not go to inappropriate films. And I think something similar was also, so I think there was a parallel institution in Germany. And so in 1933, I forget now the film that came out, but there was some film that was scandalous. And so the Archbishop of Philadelphia said, I don't think Catholics should go to this film. In fact, I don't think Catholics should go to any film until Hollywood agrees to change how it makes films. And so the Catholics didn't go. Like 80% of Catholics just stopped going to the movie houses. And this was in the middle of the Depression. And so Jack Valenti is this, he's a suspicious, he's sus, as they say these days. But he was kind of like the go-between. He was like the go-between between the bishops and Hollywood moguls in the 30s. So he brokered, so the Hollywood moguls came to him and they basically asked him if they could get a meeting with the Archbishop of McIntyre of Los Angeles. And Valenti wrote in his diaries, he said, the 3 or 4 moguls, they came in on their knees and they were crying tears as big as horse turds. That was Jack Valenti's description of the scene, and that's where they agreed to the production code. So the production code was not a legally binding agreement. It was a private agreement between, and then the Catholics were the major force behind the production code. But then once they put the committee together, they said, we should probably make a production code that reflects more American values. So it was like a mixture of Protestant and Catholic sensibilities. So for example, probably for the Catholics, it wouldn't be a big deal. By that point, for the Catholics, it wouldn't be a big deal to see somebody drinking or smoking in a scene. But they thought, well, given Protestant sensibilities, that should be part of the production code, like not to show that stuff, right? So obviously these kinds of things, as Plato says, right, these kinds of laws are in constant need of updating because change happens, so you always need to update the laws. So during the Second World War, there were no real strong efforts either in the United States or in Germany to break that code. In the 1950s, in both countries, there were like strong efforts to break that code. The movie that broke the code in the United States was The Pawnbroker. And the scene that they portrayed in that film to break the code was a black prostitute who was doing business with a survivor of the Holocaust. right? I mean, it's laughable now, but that's what they at the time they. But if you watch, I don't recommend watching the movie, but I don't think anybody other than the fact that broke the code speaks about it as a movie of artistic value, right? And in Germany, the movie that they really they used Ingmar Bergman more to try to break the code, so to have more artistic, more like someone with more artistic cachet. So in basically, though, in the United States, after the pawnbroker, which was 1963, there was nothing until they came up with the rating systems, which was, I think, the mid-70s. And then in Germany, I think it took until 1970 or so to where they finally broke the German institution. And I say this because, so Ratzinger at the Second Vatican Council, one of the proposals at the Second Vatican Council in the initial Ottaviani schema was that, given what we've seen of these battles back and forth, maybe we should just set up our own. Maybe we should set up the entire system ourselves, from finance to actors, finance, producers, directors, actors, the whole film production, distribution, even to having our own movie houses. So one of obviously Ottaviani's proposals were not but his proposal was, given these battles that we have, maybe that's what we should do. And so this is one of those areas where at the Second Vatican Council, certainly after the council, there's, in almost every place, there's no effort really anymore to update the production code or to try to implement it. So the Legion of Decency, it goes away, the German equivalent goes away. And this is one of the reasons I go through all this is just that, one of the questions is that, like, there was I don't have it right here on me, but I could dig it up if we wanted to. But by the early 1970s, in Germany, there's just a kind of, the office that's supposedly dealing with movies and culture and whatnot, it gives just some sort of vague desire that, well, we're going to try to do what we can to work with those in the entertainment industry to produce things with wholesome values. But there's no longer an institutional mechanism to bring this about. So one of the desires of the Council Fathers that they clearly tabled Ottaviani's proposals. And Ratzinger himself will say, right, when at the council, we decided not to take that kind of approach because we wanted to take a different approach. And so then the question is, what's the different approach? Right? I think that's a question that still kind of stands. But this is where I think it can be helpful to, in the realm of culture, right? Some of these battles, I think this may be too much to say, or this may be too graphic, but I always think of the Cristero movement, where the Mexican people kind of were rising up in the 1920s against the excessively secularist, atheist secularist government, and to the point where they were fighting, like physically fighting, right? And so, but at one point, the Vatican says, stop fighting, right? And so at that point, there's reprisals against the Catholics. And there's another, from the 20s until, the church wasn't legalized in Mexico until the 90s, until the 1990s. It finally obtained status as a legal entity. So I think in the Second Vatican Council, there's kind of an equivalent of the Cristero moment, where the church basically just says, let's have peace. Let's not engage in the cultural battle on this level. And I think this is something that's on Ratzinger's mind the rest of his life. But it's still a question that I have, because he never really, it may not be his point, right? Because there's some people that are just very good at ideas and relating ideas, and there's other people who can implement strategies, like institutional strategies. I don't think he was an institutional strategist. Let me put it. I guess that's the way to put it. So, anyway, so the point of the first one was just to kind of lay out some of these, and then there's more we could lay out, some of these battles of the pre-Vatican II realities. And so last time was more Vatican II. And by the way, even just something that's even like just this week, right? We had the last couple of weeks, we had the FBI Catholics. We are on the FBI watch list, all of us here, right? If ever you think someone's not listening to you, don't worry, the NSA is always listening to you, right? But, no, so I know people who are on that list. And, but even, and actually I've at least written for a journal that's on that list. I can say that much. But I bring that up to say that, just again, my two little things on social media are Twitter and Telegram. So, but just going on Twitter and Telegram during these last 2 weeks, again, people bring up that, and people brought up things that are relevant for this, and that number one, for example, that after the Marshall Plan so the Morgenthau Plan was the plan that kind of led to the Hunger Years in Germany, right? Morgenthau Plan was never fully implemented because Marshall stepped in with his associates. I doing a little bit of research. There was a book that was written in the 30s on basically how we can eliminate the German race by some American strategists in the equivalent of like the State Department. Right. I mean, they were getting that serious. I mean, that level of, and Morgenthau was kind of more in that school. So Marshall comes in, but when Marshall comes in and implements the Marshall Plan, he also implements an office in New York City run by Harry Dexter White, and anything that got published in Germany had to go through that office. Right, and then also the other thing that came out. Like, so people were saying, oh, there's this FBI list. And then a friend of mine who wrote a book on this, he pointed out that, and then I don't know if you know who Jay Dyer is. He's this like Orthodox online guy. Well, he quoted from this book. He was doing a little interview with a lady, basically about how now, they were talking about the FBI list. And then they were sharing experiences on how they felt that there were certain FBI agents that were infiltrating their churches. Like these mysterious people would show up, they would be in church for like 6 months, they didn't seem to know what they were doing, and then they would disappear, right? So then Jay Dyer, on this little conversation that he was having, right, he quoted from this book, and I helped the guy do the research to get some of the materials, but basically, he unearthed a program that Henry Luce and Time Magazine ran along with the CIA in the 1950s, and he quoted from the CIA document of how, we're going to try to go. The document was not just meant for Catholics. It said, but what we're going to do with Catholics, we could use with Orthodox, Hindus, Muslims, Buddhists, right? Try to enter into those organizations and then have individuals who will foster factionalism, heresies, internal institutional opposition of various sorts.
So, Father, on that, was the goal to secularize all of these people or to Americanize them?
Yeah, so the book, I think the book is to, basically the story of the book is that they saw the Catholic Church as the institutions of the Catholic Church could become useful institutions for communicating in an international audience, the four freedoms. And Henry Luce's specific idea was the four freedoms of America, right? So the term that they came up with for what they were doing was called doctrinal warfare, right? So not to secularize it so much as to use it as a mechanism for delivering ideas all over the world through its institutions. That could have the effect of secularizing it, but I don't think they thought of secondary or tertiary effects. I think they were just thinking of, as part of the Cold War. It was kind of like part of the Cold War. America is the salvific nation, and that kind of stuff. So I mentioned that because it was actually, again, I think we said this last time, it was actually Time magazine that coined the term, the spirit of Vatican II. It was Michael Novak, who was a reporter for Time magazine, along with Robert Blair Kaiser, during the Second Vatican Council. And it'd be interesting to, again, my friend who wrote this one book, he did interview Robert Blair Kaiser before he died, just asking him about what he was actually doing in Rome in the 1960s. Because it seems like they were there more to influence than to report. Like, so Robert Blair Kaiser would throw, I think on a weekly or bi-weekly basis, he would have these, lavish appetizers. And he would invite the parity and the bishops and the cardinals, whoever wanted to come could come to one of these Time magazine appetizers. So I bring that up because this is Cardinal Ratzinger will eventually, again, it's in the 60s where he sees that he's not at one with what we now know as the concilium people, right? That part of the reason, so Ratzinger writes the intervention of Frings in October or November of 1962, which is the intervention that changes the focus. It leads them to table the Ottaviani out schemas, because they basically say, look, it was too much of a. The major criticisms would be that the Ottaviani schema was too negative towards the modern world, that it didn't allow for some of these alternative approaches. In Ratzinger's mind, it was not to deny the faith, it was more to put the traditional teachings in a different context. And when you read documents of the Second Vatican, like I'm in a reading group right now with some of the professors here, unfortunately non-divinity school professors, right?
Fortunately.
well, depending on your evangelization,
Sure.
depending on the mode of evangelization you're interested in, right? But so we were reading Gaudium et Spes, and it's really striking. It was really striking on Thursday. Several of them, actually, they're all converts. All the ones in this, they're all converts. But they had never read Gaudium et Spes before. But one thing that really struck them about reading the document is that the document, at least in the first 30 points, really it does a lot of work of trying to say we understand the situation of modern man. We understand, and it has a fairly robust description of atheism and the causes of atheism, and also there are Catholics through their bad behavior have contributed to atheism. There's a lot of good stuff in there so in other words, it's not just the question of a more traditional, I don't want to say traditional, but let's say in the early 20th century, the approach was, can there be atheists would be the question. The answer would be no, right? There can be no atheists because there are ways we can show that God exists. And then they would boom, 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 right? So a little bit, but then it's interesting, right? Because then one of the professors on Thursday pointed out, he said, it's interesting, right? There's a paragraph where the Council Fathers say, after giving all of these causes of atheism and saying, we understand you atheists and we sympathize with you. But then it says, but then there's a paragraph that begins something to the effect of, now that we've kind of gone through all this, we still firmly and boldly, and then oftentimes though with sorrow in our hearts, proclaim that reason leads us to the existence of God, right? Which is the traditional teaching. So you can see how the intention of someone like a Ratzinger at the Second Vatican Council, to my mind, at this point, is not to deny, is to put the teachings in a different context, right? And a kind of dialogical formula, right? Which means yeah, more could be said also. Like so you could read the causes of atheism and you could say, well, there's more even. I mean, there's even more causes of atheism that we could point to. Or you could say, well, maybe one of these causes isn't quite right. They just got it wrong, right? So Ratzinger in 2005, when he's speaking to the Roman Curia, and every time he spoke after that about the Second Vatican Council, he would keep coming back to, right, this reality that there's a spirit of the Vatican II which is not exactly correct, because it seems like those who are promoting the spirit of Vatican II, they're oftentimes trying to go far beyond the true spirit of the council, right? Because they're trying to say, and again, some of these debates go back to the 1820s and the 1830s, especially in Germany, that after the cataclysm of the French Revolution, there was some schools that emerged in Germany. Things had so changed, right, that basically, so now we need just to table. This also happened in France in the 18th century, right? There were many French Catholics in the 18th century. After John Locke, things have so changed that we just need to recast all of Catholic teaching in the light of John Locke. So in the 18th century, in the 19th century, there were Germans who were doing the same thing, either using, and I'm not picking on Germans, I'm just focusing on that because that's where Ratzinger comes from, right? But
Luther as well comes from Germany.
Yeah, but I think that's a separate. I think that's a bigger, a different. But so like because this is within Catholic circles, I guess is yeah. So in the 19th century, there were those who were saying, and actually Luther would be even different, because Luther was proposing a kind of return to the foundations, in a way that what the 19th centuries were saying is they were saying either because of, and you could list the thinker, right? Either because of Rousseau or Kant or Hegel or Lamennais or Marx, right? Or I don't know, pardon?
Locke.
Or well, yeah, the Germans weren't so into. They never were that deluded. I'm sorry, but so I mean, but you know the basic tenor was things have so changed, right? There's been such a shock to the system that almost we have to start over again. Right, and this happens, and so there are some who go into the Second Vatican Council, kind of with the same spirit, a little bit like because of the, and maybe I think some of it just comes out of the historical experiences of the 20th century, because of the First World War, because of the Second World War, because of the Holocaust, right? These horrors. We have to kind of recast how we do everything. And that faction is very strong in the papacy of John Paul II. And in fact, I think we even said it last time, that this novel, Windswept House, which Malachi Martin himself, he's the author of Windswept House, he was also one of these, in the 1960s, he was one of these he would be at the Robert, in fact, he ran off with Robert Blair Kaiser's wife, unfortunately, right, in the 60s. So, but he was at these appetizers in the 60s with Novak and Kaiser, right? And so they were all of this kind of more pre-concilium conspirators, right, of a certain kind. But by the 1990s, Martin is a priest and an exorcist, doing regular shows with Art Bell, but then writing these novels. Like he wrote a novel about the Jesuits, and then he wrote this novel, Windswept House, which Windswept House, it strikes me, I only read it for the first time in 2018 or 19. And having lived through the 90s and knowing, and it's one of these novels where you actually can there's websites you can go to that said this character is this cardinal, this character is this bishop, this character is this priest, right? So there's a lot of, and I know people who looked into the story of Agnes. Agnes is, there's a scene, is kind of an occult sacrifice ritual that is going on in Rome and somewhere in the States at the same time in the novel. And it's supposedly based on the testimony of a woman named Agnes. And I know a reporter who interviewed Agnes to see if he could report her story. And in the end, he didn't, because he just thought he couldn't verify it. There were too many things about it that weren't consistent, but that he couldn't verify. Now, he interviewed Agnes in the late 80s. So this Agnes character is in, or the event surrounding this Agnes character is in Windswept House. And so it's one of these novels that is almost a history book, right? But he chose to write it as a novel for all sorts of reasons. So, but one of the things that kind of comes out of this novel, is that it seems like John Paul II was really intent on saying we're going to shore up Catholic morality, right? We're going to shore up Catholic morality. We're going to try to shore up seminaries and get priests who are rooted in the Gospels and, capable of dealing with the problems of modern man, right? And, focused on really communicating the sacraments. And then everything else, I think for John Paul II, he was like, everything else, these naturalists, so long as they don't spew obvious heresy, we'll kind of let them hang around. And that's kind of the image that you get in Windswept House, that there were all these characters that they were really looking down on, and the two figures they really look down on are John Paul II and Cardinal Ratzinger, right? Like if it wasn't for them, if it wasn't for Wojtyla and Ratzinger, we would have our way. It's like one time I used to live at a residence in South Bend, Indiana, and one time there was a conference. This would have been in the 80s before I got there, but there was a bishop was coming into the local university for a conference, and the administrator of the local university picked this bishop up at the airport and was kind of driving him around town. And before going to the university, they stopped in front of my residence. And the administrator said, if it wasn't for this house, we would have had our way here 20 years ago, right? And then the bishop said, I'm glad you told me that. I'm going to tell them. And so he got out and knocked on the door. And whoever answered the door, he said, well, I think this is like a point of pride for you guys. You should know this, right? Like, you've defended the Catholic identity of this place against all odds, right? And they just told me that. So, but I think that's a little bit that was like the sense of, and also right when Benedict was elected, I had this conversation with Cardinal George, right? And where Cardinal George said that Cardinal George said that, in a way, Benedict's been elected because the cardinals, they're looking for someone who could be like the next John Paul II, who could maybe have a longer papacy and implement, obviously a little bit of a good, but maybe a little shifted vision. But they don't think they don't think that person is apparent yet. So that they elected Benedict to be kind of like a placeholder for John Paul II's, I mean this in a good sense, agenda, right? Or his plan. Yes.
Father, why do you think it was that Francis, because he was one of the front runners at the conclave that elected Benedict as well.
Yeah.
What do you think prompted the cardinals eventually to opt for Cardinal Bergoglio when it was... He's very clearly not... he's a cardinal as well. When he was clearly not, the Ratzinger or Wojtyla style administrator.
From what they themselves have said, that the people that wanted Francis to be Pope, they identified him in the 90s as like their man.
Who is the
And
they here? Martini?
This would be Martini and the people kind of around Martini.
Like Parolin, the Italian cardinals. Is that?
I don't know if Parolin is quite there, quite in that circle. I don't know if he would go to their meetings in Switzerland, for example. Right? No, they themselves gave themselves the title of the St. Gallen Mafia. Right? That's right. So Martini, Martini was the head of the St. Gallen Mafia, and they themselves were looking for. I mean, they are convinced like we have to change fundamental things. And I think they thought that Francis would be like another placeholder, but that could show that they also knew that Bergoglio would not overturn anything of Catholic doctrine. But they thought that he would be the closest to their position. And then they also thought he would be kind of a placeholder, closest to their position, so that they could maybe try to say, well, this is actually is a fruitful way to go. If the Bergoglio papacy kind of works out, right? Then they could use that then to say, well, we can push this even further, right?
So Bergoglio was elected presumably because the moderates thought that he was moderate enough that they could support him.
Yeah. So, actually, this gets us to the Regensburg Address, and also to the two things. First of all, are there any questions or comments? Because really, all I've done, I think, is summarize what we've done before. But I think it's helpful. At least for me, it's helpful to do that. But are there any questions or comments on anything? Because this is naturally leading to now what I want to say. Yeah.
I suppose, how is it that Benedict did get elected?
How did he get elected?
Yes, it seems like if maybe a strong faction is trying to shift the window,
So,
that would be inimical.
So my understanding, again, I'm basing my comments on what Cardinal George told me, who was there at the conclave, and what John Allen's kind of the dean of American journalists. My understanding of things a little bit is that I was told this by one of my great professors as an undergraduate, that first you have journalism. And journalism is like the 2 to 5 year assessment of an event. And then from journalism, you get the social sciences, which is the 5 to 60 year assessment of how things are going, right? Or what happened. And then you get history, right? History is the 60 year to 200 to 300 year assessment of an event. And then you get philosophy and theology, right? Which is the 200 to 500 year assessment of what's going on, right? So a little bit we're still in the social science stage of that. And I think a little bit, right? So part of the seminars we're approaching it. A lot of what I'm giving is the journalist and social science approach, with a view to some of the philosophical and theological currents that we see running from the French Revolution to the present, that Ratzinger himself is situating himself in his life. That's his life work. So Cardinal George told me, and then John Allen, that the conclave essentially, they wanted to, basically the majority of the cardinals, they wanted to send a message to this. I'll just use the term for the sake of the conversation. The majority of the cardinals wanted to send a message to the St. Gallen Mafia: we're not interested in your shenanigans, right? We don't want to go there. We understand that the John Paul II approach, or something like that, is the way to go. We also understand that there may be some things that, some people criticize John Paul II for the way he dealt with Latin America, that he was too kind of heavy-handed in the way he dealt with Latin America. He didn't really understand the situations there. I mean, that was Bergoglio, right? Bergoglio was kind of part of that, right? So there were some that said, basically, we want the John Paul II approach, but we have to kind of also change, especially now that the Cold War is gone, we're going to have to change some of the ways that he did things. Again, without changing doctrine. So I think the people that elected Benedict, which was the majority, they wanted to say, look, we we want to continue the John Paul II approach. And maybe the St. Gallen Mafia convinced them that there was no one who could kind of continue the John Paul II approach for like the next 30 years. That they hadn't found that guy yet. But they at least wanted to there was enough of them to send this message of, well, Benedict is the one who he's the representative of the John Paul II approach. So we want to send a message that we still think this is a valid approach. Right? So John Allen, he thought that, and Cardinal George, they both thought that that's why he was elected, that there still weren't enough cardinals to say, we're going to kind of go with the St. Gallen Mafia. And then John Allen or someone, I don't know if it was Cardinal George or John Allen, but someone said that it became apparent to Bergoglio during the conclave that the St. Gallen Mafia was trying to get him to be elected pope as a way of undermining John Paul II's papacy. Kind of that they were going to start to promote it as a way of undermining John Paul II's papacy. And when he realized that, he basically started saying, don't vote for me, vote for Benedict. Yes.
Just a question, Father, from a genuine sort of sense of curiosity. The thing that I'm often concerned about and struggle to find a coherent response to, apart from you gave the different breakdowns, philosophy, theology, but at the socio-cultural level, the social science level, how do you respond to people within the church that have a very bleak view of the current papacy, as well as of so from the sense that I get from listening to your talk thus far is that Francis, at least until this point, Cardinal Bergoglio seems to be a sincere, at least if slightly liberation theology,
He's a Latin American leftist populist.
Who's still in favor of some sort of JP2-esque,
yeah,
supportive of Benedict.
Yeah.
What do you think changed, and if anything,
between Benedict and
the Francis papacy? And how do you respond to people that would say that there's a very bleak view for the church ahead,
right,
in terms of the liberalism that might be brought in in a post-Francis era?
So I would say I think obviously that's a question that I think my hypothesis, I'll give you my hypothesis. My hypothesis is that the St. Gallen Mafia, that they surrounded Benedict with people that frustrated his papacy. And that basically created, and they may have been conspiring with, I was in Rome when Benedict stepped down, and all sorts of strange things were happening. I mean, I was thinking about this coming over here today, right? The day he resigned, there was a hailstorm. And not long before he resigned, there was all the Vatican Bank apparatus shut down, right? That could only be done by outside institutions, right? So something's going on. I mean, there's something going on here where they're trying to create. The other thing is someone, they were doing everything they could to block what he wanted to do. So John Allen wrote an article at one point when it's precisely one of the documents we're discussing today, right? Summum Pontificorum. That, and actually that document, Regensburg, the other thing, that the establishment of the Anglican ordinariate, apparently behind the scenes, Benedict was he said, these are the initiatives that I as Pope want to make. I want to take these initiatives. Why? I want to heal the wound of schism. The Lefebvreites, Pius X people, right? I want to heal the wound of schism. The other thing, I want to create a path for Anglicans to come into the church. And that is against the vision of the St. Gallen Mafia. It's they're like, and apparently they were doing everything they could within the Vatican apparatus. So Benedict would send to an office, study the question of, he would send to the office of the liturgy, study the question of what kind of liturgy we could have for Anglicans that come into the church, and they wouldn't study it. They would just not cooperate. Or study the way. Now, actually, I know one person who was on the Ecclesia Dei Commission, right? The commission trying to heal the wounds with the Lefebvrites, and that commission would do its work, and then there would always be somebody that would block its proposal. So John Allen wrote. He doesn't write about the blocking part. He said it happened with the Anglican Ordinariate. It also happened with Summum Pontificorum, that when Benedict went to announce these documents, nobody appeared with him. He appeared alone. And John Allen said, this is not usual in the Vatican, right? This is not how you... And the way John Allen wrote about it at the time, he said, this is where I think John Allen was wrong. I mean, I don't like the way he did it, but John Allen wrote at the time of like, Benedict has a PR problem. Like in the West, and he would say, maybe Benedict doesn't understand how PR works. Right? In the West, when you're doing things that are kind of controversial like this, you got to work behind the scenes with your bureaucracy, and then when you make the announcement, you as the leader got to have flanking at your side all the major cardinals that could be involved in the decision, right? Because that image gives kind of strength of the appearance. But all the cardinals, so what John Allen doesn't say, right, is that behind the scenes, all these cardinals were doing everything they could to, because they were connected with the St. Gallen Mafia. Right. They were doing everything they could to block him from doing anything. And so he just does it himself. In the appointment of bishops and in the appointment of cardinals, they wouldn't help him doing research. So he kind of had to do his own research to find, like, I'm going to put, like, the guy who's now in San Francisco, or I'm going to put Jose Gomez in Los Angeles, or I'm going to put, right? So he would do all these appointments, and then John Allen would write about it, or some other journalist would write about it, saying, well, he's not exercising synodality or collegiality within the Vatican. He's just kind of doing his own thing. Right, but then behind the scenes, they weren't cooperating with him. Right, so.
Can I ask I guess two questions.
Yeah.
First, so what are the ostensible reasons given for not cooperating or for pushing back? What are the how do they engage?
So I think most people don't know. Like this is like inside the Vatican type stuff, right? That they weren't cooperating with him. I don't think that gets reported. That doesn't get reported so much. I know that from people that I've talked to, right? What John Allen, so John Allen being the dean of journalism, he probably knew it, but what he reported was something different, just slightly different. Like but what he reported was Benedict should have done no more work to get his cardinals on board with his vision, so that they would appear with him in public.
No, I get that. But I guess what I'm asking is, so the St. Gallen group, right?
Yeah.
So just to steelman their argument, it's kind of following up on your question. So, maybe after World War II, World War I and World War II, the German question, the church question, it's all entwined. We need to do some metaphysical weakening,
Yeah.
And so why do we need to do this? Well, these are dangerous institutions, dangerous, European thing going on here. Okay.
Yeah.
So what do? We try to prevent what's an argument then? No unity in the church, right? Or what? Privatistic religion?
No, so I think the argument
the ultimate
I think
goal.
Yeah, here? I think the St. Gallen Mafia I think their argument would be
like the best version of it.
I think the best version of it would be, look, let these people die.
Okay.
In the sense of, they would say, you can look at in the 19th century, there were the German, there was this one group that didn't go along with the First Vatican Council. And the old Catholics, right? And the church never really condemned them, but didn't really engage with them either. Mm-hmm. And so the idea was like, just let them
wither away.
Let them just kind of wither away, without either. So don't excommunicate them necessarily, but don't bring them back in either. Don't give them a platform. So don't give them a platform by condemning them, but don't give them a platform by approving them in any way either. And so like this thing of the liturgy, in the history of the church, there was like in the lifetime of St. John Chrysostom, at one point there were like 3 or 4 schismatic churches in Antioch, right? based on different controversies and persecutions, right? And so they would say stuff like, well, in the history of the church, this kind of stuff happens. And yeah, you do what you can behind the scenes to mediate, but you don't give in too much, right? You don't excommunicate, but you don't give in too much. Otherwise, you give them a platform for them to kind of get on their hobby horse in some issue that is just going to be a thorn in the side for the church and it's not worth defending. So like a lot of the controversy with Summum Pontificorum, it has to do with the prayers during the Holy Week, where they pray for the conversion of the Jews, right? And it's even like, how do they pray for it's like, it's not that they pray for the conversion of the Jews, but what's the language that they're using to pray for the conversion of the Jews, right? So even when he allows for Summum Pontificorum, he changes the prayer for the conversion of the Jews in the Old Mass. Because why? The St. Gallen people are saying we have to be, because of the Holocaust, we have to be sensitive to the Jewish perception of how we pray, right? And so we have to, so like another thing, the St. Gallen Mafia, going back to the Middle Ages, there was an office in the Vatican specifically dedicated to the evangelization of the Jewish people. Right? So I think finally it was Benedict who closed down that office. I said, obviously, a Jewish person can convert, but we're not going to have a special office like the mission to the Jewish people. It's funny, when I was in Rome, one day they asked me to accompany the New York Times religion reporter was bringing a class of a bunch of journalists to Rome to like learn about the Vatican. And they asked me to kind of accompany them one day. And so I walked with them to the Jewish synagogue. And across the street from the Jewish synagogue is a Catholic church. And they put on the facade of the church, they put passages from the Book of Lamentations, right? But the Jewish guy, the Jewish reporter for the New York Times, when we get to the synagogue, he points at that church and he says, "Look at that anti-Semitic diatribe." I mean, it's written in Latin, so you can't really read it, right? What is that Catholic Church saying? It's saying we all need to convert, right? And we need to be forced to convert. How could they do that? And then one of the kids was a classicist. He wasn't even Catholic, right? And he says to the reporter, he says, I think that's just saying, I think that's from the Book of Lamentations. I think that's one of your books. Right? But I think the St. Gallen Mafia people, they would say, well, look, if this is the attitude of a typical person, right, and we want to meet people where they are, as the Second Vatican Council says we should do, right, the way it deals with atheism in Gaudium et Spes, we should do everything we can, right, to try to put this guy at ease in how we pray and how we speak. Right, we shouldn't do anything that might, foment his fears.
A follow-up question then, moving to Summum Pontificum. Then, it seems that now are the changes between the Benedict and Francis papacy the realization of, well, these people just won't die. These people just won't go away.
That's the St. Gallen Mafia argument.
Yeah, that, we have to move from Summorum Pontificum to Traditionis Custodes. And because it seems, is there a realization that, well, the Benedict papacy was not some sort of, middle ground, but, it's giving the sort of traditionalists too much of sort of energy to keep going. Yeah,
well, I think the St. Gallen argument would be that it may have been intended, like, so for example, just to give a little example here, so I know someone who was going to visit with Bishop Williamson. Bishop Williamson is one of the 3 bishops that were ordained by Marcel Lefebvre that triggered the excommunication in the 1980s. So he's one of the leaders of the Lefebvrist movement.
He's been chucked out of that movement as well.
Well, yeah, no, I know, but so he's one of the characters. He's one of the bishops that in the 1980s there was this commission that was set up, Ecclesia Dei, And the goal of that commission was to dialogue with these bishops that were ordained to try to bring them back into the church. And then when Benedict proclaims this Summum Pontificorum, he basically says, we got to do even more dialogue now, because he lifts the excommunications of these bishops. And then he says, well, now we have to do even more dialogue to bring these people back into the church. So I have a friend that was invited by Bishop Williamson to give a talk to his group on morality, so ethics and morality and whatnot. So my friend came to me and said, isn't it true that you know one of the priests who's on this commission that's in dialogue with the schismatics? And I said, yeah. So he said, well, I know this has been done in the past. Could you ask the priest that you know, is there any message that I could deliver to Bishop? I'm going to be there anyway. We're going to have a private conversation. And is there any message that I could deliver to him? Kind of behind the scenes a little bit, an unofficial message. So I asked my friend, and my friend got word to me and said, yes, there is a message you could give. Tell him the window is open, but it's going to shut. I mean, there's only a certain amount of time where you can go through the window, right? And it's not going to be more than a few more years, right? So the church always is a little bit slower than we think, right, in these matters. So my friend gave the guy the message. And the guy, when my friend gave Williamson the message, he pulled out of his drawer a document, and the document was, I am willing to accept Vatican II interpreted in the light of previous tradition and magisterial teaching. And he told my friend, Archbishop Lefebvre would have signed this document, but I will not. Why? Well, because why? Now I have a group. And now, if I sign this document, I'll lose my group. I mean, that's the schismatic mentality, I think. But also the other thing that Summum Pontificorum did, it allowed for, actually already in the 80s, there was the Priestly Society of Fraternity of St. Peter, right? There's been a number of institutes that have grown up now, right? The Institute of Christ the King, but now you have the status of the Society of Pius X. You have all these groups. I think the St. Gallimafi would say, you look at the example of Williamson, he won't even sign what Lefebvre would have signed, right? So they're not operating in good faith. The second thing they would say, they're not operating in good faith, and the only thing that Benedict's document did is it gave them a platform. It gave them a platform to broadcast. And then the other thing is that, I think the other thing that St. Gallimafi would say is that they have been very effective using the internet to basically make their position a much more widely heard position than their actual numbers. So the window has to close. And I think that they're also kind of trying to go back to the like they're treating it like the 70s. Like we have to put restrictions, if necessary, on individual priests down to that level so as to discipline those priests so that they see there's no going back.
Yeah.
There's no going back to, right? So like if for whatever reason you want to use that mass for piety and whatnot, you can, but you can't build a future church on it.
Mm.
I think that's the St. And I think the St. Gallen people on this, they've won the majority of bishops.
Including the Holy Father.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, just from what you discussed, it seems very compelling, because when you, at least from my perspective, coming of age under the Benedict papacy and then under the Francis papacy, the Francis papacy at the start seemed very hopeful. I mean, he was selecting people like Cardinal Pell to man the economy. He kept on Mueller to be the Congregation Doctrine of the Faith. He appoints O'Malley to head the sexual abuse crisis.
Right.
It seemed like a pretty dynamic if slightly liberation theology.
Yeah.
He was even meeting with the Society of St. Pius X people, because even as Archbishop of Buenos Aires, he was well known for being conciliar towards the Latin Mass community, because they're all working class,
Yeah.
Essentially the types of people that liberation theologians like. Whereas the papacy now he's appointed, my old bishop to be, Cardinal Lazarus to be the head of the dicastery for clergy.
My boss.
Yeah, your new boss now, with the shutting down of shutting down Ecclesia Dei. All of that. Does it seem like a Cardinal Bergoglio type move? Do you think that there's a change between Cardinal Bergoglio, the early Pope Francis, and then a later sort of Galen-inspired Francis?
Again, this is.
He was quoting Martini like a while ago.
The last couple of years he's been reading Martini. Yeah, and I think that now, certainly in the beginning, he was. I think now he's relying much more on his Jesuit advisors. And so, for example, even on
The Jesuits.
Yeah. So even now, I'm living with 2 Spaniards right now, and apparently Francis has recently granted some interviews in some Spanish newspapers, and their sense is that he was asked several questions about decisions he's made. And their sense of the answers was that he wasn't fully aware of the decisions that he made. So that he's relying on certain advisors and just kind of just trusting them and not fully. These are obviously not for he's not proclaiming dogmas or anything like that, but just like what to do type stuff. So my guess is that, and people have written about, for example, like the Office of Liturgy right now, it's kind of operating on its own. And there doesn't seem to be much oversight. There just seems to be a willingness just to sign whatever comes through.
So who do you think is calling the shots on the appointments to the College of Cardinals then?
Well, it's probably a combination of the papal nuncios and then the new fellow now that's in charge of the Congregation of Bishops. I forget the guy's name.
The Portuguese.
Yeah. And now this American guy, this Augustinian, I forget all the names. No, but I think there's in other words, I think in a way, on the micro level, things are optimistic, because we have the society here, right? And you can micro, or around here, if you're a Catholic, you can point to a lot of good things that are happening at the university. on a macro level, things don't look so good. It's like we're in the moment where the church is in a storm, right? But we're in the boat, and in the boat we can kind of operate and row and do our thing. But it seems like on the macro level, it's hard to see. That's why I think Windswept House is actually a good. I mean, that's kind of the picture of Windswept House, right? Yeah. That there's some micro things that are happening. So again, John Allen. Right before the pandemic hit, I think John Allen, again, who's the dean of American Catholic journalists, he came to Harvard, he went to Princeton, he went to Notre Dame, he went to several different places, and his column was something like, everywhere, everybody is angry about the bigger picture of the church, something's going wrong. Angry and frustrated, and all local groups, they're angry and frustrated, but locally and in the micro, they think they're doing very well and they're working really hard. So that was the article that John Allen wrote. I thought that was an accurate assessment. So I would just say we're just in one of those. If the boat is the church, right? We're not in a time of calm. We're in one of those times where we're in a storm, and it seems like Christ is asleep or he's not here. And we're rowing against the wind, but we're rowing, right? So that's the image I think that's a helpful one for our own time. I think also that one of the ways that Summum Pontificorum got derailed is because of the Williamson affair. It's because of Williamson, actually.
really the SSPX that sort of pushed the other way.
Yeah, and I think the reason. So in other words, since the Second Vatican Council, and having lived in Rome, I can also say this, and you can sense it in Ratzinger's writings, especially. The next time I like to look at some of his posthumous writings, even if we just read the AI translations, because I think they published it in Italian, and then people did a bunch of AI translations, and then they stopped publishing it in Italian. So and apparently they're not going to do it in English now. So that all the more I think we got to read it while we can. We got to read it. So anyway, but in a lot of his, it seems to me that there's a big effort, both a theological, like this is part of the Second Vatican Council, and it's part of Ratzinger's writings. It's like when I met him, and when I met Charlie Brown, not the cartoon character, the man who's now the nuncio to the Philippines. He's a Notre Dame grad. So I
Field goals?
Pardon?
Is he kicking field goals?
That's right. Yeah, theological field goals. No, but he's a priest from New York who worked in the CDF, and I met him, and he told me something that I think is also true. That again, we at least need to understand it as we're doing theology in our time. It's very much on the mind of Benedict, especially after the council, is the council of the media, right? The extent to which the media, like even when the council is writing about modern man, what are they writing about, right? They're writing about an impression that they're getting from modern man that's coming from the intelligentsia through the media. It's not necessarily about like the modern working man, right? It's not necessarily about, it's funny. I know this is maybe a little bit homey, right? But every time I go home, someone in my family's not intellectual at all, right? They're just ordinary. Many of them don't have college degrees. They're working class, entrepreneurial type stuff, like running bowling alleys, or running landscaping businesses, or my brother plows snow in the winter in Detroit. This kind of stuff. And I'm always amazed every time I go home, because like over the last 20 or 30 years, in an intellectual environment, I'll be told, oh, you got to take Lady Gaga seriously, right? You got to figure out the imagery in Lady Gaga's videos and this and that and the other thing, and there's all this stuff going on, right? And then I go home, and my brother will say to me or my sister will say to me, or my cousin will say to me, "Did you see the song It's Corn?" Right? Which is this video on YouTube with this little black boy who's eating corn with butter on it and talking about it and how awesome it is. And it has 29 million views, right? This is not Lady Gaga, right? Or the last time, and then, but then it's interesting because for example, this just happened to me where I was home and someone pointed out to me the song It's Corn. And I go to our schools, which is grade school and high schools. And I just mentioned the song. And everyone's like, "Whoa!" I mean, that's what everybody's. That's modern man, It's not this angsty, nihilistic, using Catholic imagery. It's like it's corn, man. But then, so there is a little bit of a, so like modern man. Oftentimes, it seems to me it's a stylized version of a certain kind of modern person, right? What we would call in the U.S. the person, the 10% in the managerial class, right? Ivy League educated, who has acquired a number of theoretical constructs or complexes or right, that need to be dealt with, and that they think are very important. And that doesn't mean that they're not important for that class. But it's funny. When I was at Notre Dame, I met some French people who were Lefebvres, who come to Notre Dame and they meet the traditional Latin Mass people at Notre Dame, and they were kind of disgusted by them. They said things like, these are just uneducated, working class, unsophisticated people. I'm going back to France. right? Why? Because the Lefebvrists in France, they're more aristocratic. They're more the elite, right? It's more of an elite phenomenon. Whereas, actually, one of the problems of the extraordinary form, the traditional Latin Mass people in the U.S. is that, and they'll say this amongst themselves when they get talking, is that we don't have any intellectuals. We have very few intellectuals. They have some. I know some, right? But they precisely say we have to produce more intellectuals, right? Because we just have it always seems like there's just one or two of us, right? In each, and you go to and it's true, like the Latin Mass community in South Bend, Indiana, it's a lot. It's like police officers and firefighters and landscapers and then now some Notre Dame students or some Notre Dame professors, but the base of the parish is actually kind of working class.
Yeah.
So, but the Williamson affair, I think, was what is the Williamson affair? Just to kind of go into it a little bit. So,
Father, thank you. We have to head out, unfortunately.
You do?
Have a baby shower to attend.
Wow. Okay. Oh, so we this week.
No,
not
not
this week. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Great. Enjoy the shower. So the Williamson affair is. So Williamson is one of these bishops who is part of the schismatic movement promoting the Latin Mass, and he's in England and Argentina, depending on what laws are banning him or threatening him with jail.
How old
So
is he now? Sorry, do you know?
he's got to be in his
70s?
late 70s, early 80s. Yeah.
He's good friends with, Father, the chaplain of my college back in Oxford, because they're both Winchester. He's a very elitist man, Cambridge.
Yeah.
Educated.
Okay. So the Williamson affair. Do you know the Williamson affair? Would you? Okay. So just to go into it. So. And actually, this is from Seewald's biography, right? The most important scandal of Benedict's pontificate is the Williamson affair, right? And it's 2009, basically. And again, I think Seewald claims this is the moment that tipped the pontificate of Benedict to the downslope that leads to his eventual dismissal. And Seewald, this is from the Seewald biography, right? That the Williamson affair sheds light on the catastrophic state of crisis management at the Vatican, the lack of support from bishops and cardinals who threw the successor of Peter under the bus. That's how Seewald puts it. And so the Williamson affair is that Williamson, among the things he got involved in Holocaust narrative research. And at one point, there was a group of Swedish filmmakers that were interviewing him for a documentary. And the documentary had nothing to do with the Holocaust or any Holocaust-type research. So as the interview was ended, after the interview, the documentary was just ostensibly about like traditional Catholic communities in England and Europe. So as the interview ended, and they were taking down some cameras, they kept another camera on. And they basically said to him, by the way, we hear you've been doing research into the Holocaust, right? What do you think about the Holocaust? And he said something to the effect of, well, clearly there was a number of people who died, but he, disputing the numbers of people who died was basically the thing. And also disputing exactly whether there were gas chambers or not, how they were used. Made a reference to Schindler's List, right, where they go into the gas chamber and they all think they're going to be gassed, but then say it's just a shower to de-lice them, right? So they basically pack up and go home. And not a whole lot is done at that point. But once he comes out with Summum Pontificorum and he lifts the excommunications, yeah, so for example, here's the quote. Williamson answered to the Swedes on the studies that he had made, he can't see how they used gas chambers. Many hundreds of thousands died in these camps, but none of them died because they were gassed. That's what they got him saying on tape. So when he comes back into when the excommunications are lifted, on January 24th, 2009, a report in Welt magazine, or Welt, right? It says this. It says that they had received an email from England, and they don't name their source, but they say they've received an email from England. If the Pope lifts the excommunication after Williamson denied the Holocaust, the enemies of the Pope will try to destroy him. We're standing on the brink of a catastrophe. Doesn't Monsignor Ganswein know this? And then, 2 days later, January 26, 2009, Süddeutsche Zeitung puts on the headlines on its front page, Pope admits Holocaust denier into the church. Right? So that begins the Williamson affair. But the way that it was cast obviously is a little bit deceptive, right? Because it's like saying the Pope has let a Holocaust denier into the church, because technically in a schism, you're outside of the sacraments, but you can still be reconciled with the church. So the headline is shocking for a reason. And then what Seewald then points out, and is that at this point, there were all sorts of threats that started to be made against the papacy, right? So, for example, we have 13 people lined up. This is in Der Spiegel. Someone says, we have 13 people lined up who are going to implicate the Pope in sex abuse scandal, right? Unless he denounces Williamson, right? So this kind of dynamic is being set up. And, or at another moment, someone says this, accordingly, it is now obvious that good relations with a fringe group is more important to the Pope than his relationship with the Jewish people, and to the moderates who represent the modernity-friendly forces within his own church. Again, these are people outside the church speaking about it now in the media. Actually, that quote was from Debbie Lipstadt. So basically what ends up happening is that during that year, more and more people basically start honing in on this thing of the Pope lets the Holocaust denier back into the church. This cannot be done. And one of the questions I think ends up being, so for example, the Frankfurter Rundschau. The Pope was once a respected German, but anyone who supports a Holocaust denier with weak excuses should ask himself how long his organization can expect to enjoy state subsidies. Another Munich newspaper refers to the Pope as a self-righteous old man, a reactionary who has the unbearable hubris to treat anyone who isn't a Catholic as a subhuman. Right? Some of them are laughable, right? But again, I think this is where the media, right? The media is being used, and of course, when I was in Rome, again, I've said this already, but when I was in Rome, it's the media means so much to them, right? It's everything they do. There's a great sensitivity to the media in any given place, and so this is I think this is one of the things where
is the ultimate fear that they'll go back to before the Concordat. The ultimate, is that what they're really afraid of?
I think the fear in Europe, is that
Vatican's afraid that they'll basically.
I think the fear is that it goes. We get to some situation where it's so hostile for the church that there's no Concordat, which defines rights and responsibilities,
right.
And then there's just mild to strong persecution against the church.
So pre-31 or whatever
Yeah,
that was.
yeah. In the case of Germany, right. In the case of Germany in particular, right, the church, the state still collects the taxes for the church.
No, but I meant Vatican itself.
Yeah. Oh, the Vatican also in
Yeah.
Italy. Yeah.
That's what I meant. Is that
Yeah.
their main?
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
okay.
so there are these like but it is interesting just the depth to which they are super concerned, like about like what the media. I think like in the U.S. right now, most people are. I think the U.S. right now, like everyone's like super skeptical about what you would call it, the mainstream media.
That's only the last 10 years.
Yeah,
Wasn't
yeah.
Like that. Yeah.
But so we're in, I think we're in a much different environment. In Rome, everybody still watches the evening news, right? Like there's still a little bit of this, and people I know from living there with people who work in the Vatican, the people in the Vatican still watch. You know, because a lot, again, I think just thinking about it, right? There's kind of a rhythm to the day, which is very unlike ours. I mean, no, because, well, no, there's times of prayer, there's times of work, right? You go to your office and work. A lot of the work, they want you to work slowly and with deliberation, not to move too quickly on things because you don't want to be precipitous in your action. And I know from living with people in Rome, especially people who work in the Vatican, right? There's not a lot of social life. And so, and then also, like, what do you do together every day? Again, you're talking about people now who are, many of them, some of them could be in their 80s, some of them could be in their 40s. Like, but what do you do that everyone can do together? You sit down at 8 o'clock at night after dinner, and you watch the Italian news, right? So that's how you get your. Apparently, even when Francis was elected, they called Benedict, and no one could get him because he was sitting in the kitchen with his cook and Ganswein, or whoever, maybe it wasn't Ganswein, but he was sitting in his kitchen watching the news, right? And they were trying to get a hold of him, but he was, watching the news. But like, so I say that just to say that has a powerful influence on the imagination of anybody who works in Rome for any amount of time, right? Especially the way the European media presents things. So I think everything from the 80s when he starts working in Rome until his death, right? That's a huge variable in the mind of his imagination.
You gotta get him on right-wing Twitter, Father.
Yeah, that's right.
Alternative news, yeah.
And so like both, I think both in a way, both Regensburg and Summum Pontificorum, almost as important or more important than the documents themselves, are the media reaction after them. Like I remember reading the Regensburg address, and the day I read it, I was like, "Oh yeah, this is just a critique of modern Enlightenment liberalism in Europe." Using, and it's kind of cute using logos as the way of. So this is an example. It's a great example of Benedict's theological approach, right? And he used the Islam reference as a way of acknowledging a professor who had just written a book on a dialogue that took place between Muslims and Christians in the Byzantine Empire, right? So his quoting of the book. But then there's a few passages in the book where you could see there is a kind of similarity. And it's also understandable if you understand some of the philosophical difficulties within Islam itself and some of the philosophical difficulties within the Enlightenment, you could see why theologically he would make this point, right? Because there's a point where Islam basically gives up on philosophy. And there's also a point where Islam essentially says, like, it's interesting to compare the Quran on the story of Joseph in the Quran with the story of Joseph in Genesis. Because the story of Joseph in Quran, it just kind of ends with Joseph and his brothers being reunited and celebrating, right? But in Genesis, right, this is where, in Genesis, right, the brothers cook up the lie. Well, Dad told us that, even though we did something bad to you, like, you shouldn't punish us, even though that's what we deserve. And that's not an exact quote, right? But then what happens? Joseph interrupts them and says, "Stop, right? I know that you intended to do evil to me, but the evil that you intended, God has turned it into good. Right? This whole understanding of, so in Islam, like one problem is the arbitrary will of God. But in Christianity, you don't have that. You have God governing the world with divine providence. And he can take things that are evil, which are not his intention, and he can turn them into good.
Felix culpa?
Yeah. Yeah, but and the story of Joseph is like the first statement of that. But in the Quran, they don't include that ending to the story of Joseph. Right? And then the other issue then is, so it's like the arbitrary will of God. The other issue then is like just the harmony between faith and reason. And of course, in Christianity, you're always working on the harmony between faith and reason. Faith and science and reason. In the Enlightenment, just like in Islam, I think that's so Benedict's theological point is that in the Enlightenment, somewhat like also in Islam, they give up on trying to harmonize faith and reason. Right? So there's a kind of truncated, Islam ends up with kind of a truncated rationality. And the Enlightenment ends up with kind of a truncated rationality. Obviously for different reasons, but you still get a truncated rationality. So you get a kind of gap between faith and reason. Whereas in Christianity, you're always trying to work towards a more harmonious vision of faith and reason. So actually the point of the Regensburg Address, it's quite, I don't know, it's for someone like me who had been studying faith and reason since the 80s, it was kind of like, well, yeah, this is a good point. I could see why he brought up I could see how he's gesturing to an academic colleague on the book that he just wrote about the dialogue between Islam and Christianity and the Byzantine Empire. Like that's a nice thing. So the first day, even in the New York Times, the Regensburg Address was Pope gives address on challenging the Enlightenment on logos, right? And then it was the next day that you get this violent outrage throughout the Muslim world, right? And even there, you sometimes people who study social media and whatnot, and I'm even speaking now about some who are not Catholic, but who studied the aftermath of the Regensburg. They say, it's very, like this one guy, he says, you always got to be suspicious when it's the BBC that keeps repeating the same event, right? There's more motives going on than just giving you the news, right? And it was the BBC that began to broadcast some events in, I think it was in Pakistan or northern India, where they were burning the Pope in effigy, right? And the other thing that was a little bit of a trigger for me, at least, is that it was a previously unheard of Islamic radical group. Like, you always got to be careful when you read the news, and there's a previously unheard of, either Jewish or Islamic group. Like, where's that coming? You got to ask yourself the question, like, where's that coming from? Who's promoting that? And I learned this because when I was doing my research into my dissertation in Rome, which is the influence of Plato in Iran in the 20th century, I came across this book by Mark Curtis called Secret Affairs. And he's a Marxist, right? But he does the one thing that Marxists do very well. He sat down in the British Library for 20 years, and he read every document he could find about the role of British agents in India, in Saudi Arabia, what became basically in the Ottoman Empire and in India in the 19th century up until the 1920s, working with and fostering radical Islamic groups, right? And it's like document after document of basically the argument of his book was there's a long track record in the Middle East and in India of the British, just as a way of establishing and governing their empire, of creating radical groups to justify their presence in those places. Right? That's just a classic way empires work. So he's not saying that this is new, like they came up with it. It's just that this is a strategy. And so it's interesting, both in the Regensburg affair and in the Williamson affair, even the newspapers in Germany, they were getting their sources from anonymous British sources, right? So and then even going back to the CIA documents I was mentioning earlier, that they also, like Henry Luce was deeply aware that we can provide sources, right? We can provide narratives, we can provide sources that are going to be like the council of the media, right? We can create the council of the media that will influence popes and bishops and cardinals, right? How they think. And if they're super concerned about the media, well, if we can create the narratives, then we're going to create also the questions that they think they have to ask and answer. And I think it is a question this is a question I haven't fully answered it yet, but I think it is worth kind of keeping in our minds. Like, to what degree is Ratzinger aware of this throughout? Especially, it seems like when I was in Rome, there were several times where I was with him and he gave an address, like saying, we can't go along with the Council of the Media, right? We can't be pressured too much by the Council of the Media. We have to develop an interpretation of the Council that isn't like subservient to the Council of the Media. And he kind of always seems to be suggesting, well, we haven't quite done that yet. And in a lot of so I hope the next time that we can also look into, especially in his posthumous writings, which are things that he wrote, those are things that he wrote from his residence as Pope Emeritus, many of these things. Right? And so when I look at them, I also want to kind of ask this question, like, to what degree, how is, it's kind of interesting, right? Just to ask the question, like, okay, he was Pope, and how often do you get a chance in history to read the documents of a Pope after he was Pope? So it's kind of a unique moment. Question or comment or? Yeah.
Father, can you just elaborate a little more about Summorum Pontificum and the theological, of course there's relations with the schismatics, but then there's also a positive vision that he lays out in terms of, what was good and true in previous generations.
So,
what can we learn from a document like Summorum Pontificum?
So I know someone who was involved both with the Anglican Ordinariate, kind of behind the scenes, with the Anglican Ordinariate and with this document. And so this is just a little bit of a personal. So the day that I was with this priest, I just happened. This is a priest of Opus Dei. He's now dead. His name is Father Bill Stetson, and he was my vicar when I joined Opus Dei in 1989. And when I was in graduate school, I would go once a week to talk with him, basically, and we read Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, and we would discuss it in his office when I was a graduate student back there in the Midwest. So when Father Bill he actually grew up in Connecticut. He was a Harvard grad, graduated here I think in '57. He was very good friends with Cardinal Law. And he was a canon lawyer himself, so he was involved in both. He himself had an Episcopalian father and a Catholic mother, and I think he used to play as a student at Harvard. He would play the organ at St. Paul's, for example, back in the '50s, and he would also play the organ at an Episcopalian church. But then at some point he just goes full Catholic, right? Obviously. So Father Bill was a delightful man, and so we happened to be together in the day that the encyclical or the motu proprio came out, and we went back we were together at a retreat house, conference center, and we went back into this library, and we got this old. It was a 1954 missal. It wasn't 62. It was 54. But we used that so I served the first day. I had never been to a traditional mass up to that point in my life. I didn't even really know much about. I had vague knowledge of it. Like, for me, Summum Pontificorum was a little bit of a surprise. I just had vague knowledge that there was the traditional mass. I'd never been to one. I knew that there were these people out there, but I didn't really know any who went to it. Right? So for me, the whole thing was kind of a surprise. But once it came out, I was like, oh, this is interesting. and I knew that St. Josemaria, the founder of Opus Dei, had said that Mass until the day he died, but that I had never seen it. So kind of just more out of curiosity, I was like, yeah, Father Bill, I'll serve your Mass. And I think because we had been buddies, like in the 90s, like discussing Samuel Huntington together and talking about bigger ideas, that he said, well, yeah, you can be the one to serve my Mass too. So I served his Mass, and where he said in the extraordinary form that day. And so after the Mass, we were kind of talking about, well, why this document? And what he said to me was, he says, well, the rule of how you pray is the rule of what you believe. And Benedict, I think now that we've had from the 70s to the early aughts, right? Now that we have all these 40 years of experience, we see that the pendulum has gone a little bit too far this way, as far as the rule of prayer, and it needs to be brought back. And he said, and it needs to be brought back because there is something about, like, we're losing, in a sense, the sense of sacrifice, that the Mass is a sacrifice. And obviously you learn every week by what you see. That does communicate to you, like, what's in your mind. It might not always be communicated, like, directly intellectually, but signs and symbols do communicate. And so when you see the Mass and it's clearly a sacrifice, right, that does help you, the participant, understand, I'm here to give something to the sacrifice. I'm participating in the sacrifice. When you see, and so somehow, so what Father Bill said, this, he thought the strategy of Benedict, because the strategy of he thought the people that were working with Benedict was, let's allow, we got to heal the schism. We have to allow for the extraordinary form we have to let it grow a little bit. We have to kind of let it plant some seeds out there so that there could be another reform of the Mass. And like Father Bill was saying to me, something like, well, maybe you do the Mass in the vernacular up until the Eucharistic prayer, and then you do the Roman canon with all of its signs and symbols. Like, so the idea being that there is something about the sacrificial nature of the Mass that has been de-emphasized. It's still there, obviously, because the Mass is always a sacrifice. But the symbolism of the new Mass has, in trying to promote more participation, maybe has promoted participation that goes a little bit in the direction of the community celebration, or which can also then become a little bit entertainment. So in other words, obviously we're not talking here about complete good versus complete bad, right? We're not talking about, go up to the altar and, we're not at that level yet, hopefully. Right? In the Old Testament where the priest who gets out his sword and starts lopping off heads, right? We're not there. We're not talking about that yet. But we're talking about a matter of emphasis, right? So Father Bill is saying that the idea, the positive vision would be you allow this Mass to be lived for a time. You allow it even to grow a little bit, so that then in 15 or 20 years you could have a maybe healthy merging of the two.
Do you think that the idea was, I can remember, like, back in Oxford, I can remember after one of the fruits of Summorum Pontificum was not just that the old rite was continued, because it was always there, but the new Mass was changed into Latin, Ad Orientem,
right?
Just basically a traditionalist old rite Mass, except just using the new calendar.
Right. Right.
I wonder what as lay people we can do to try and revive some amount of tradition in the new rite in the community of this parish.
Well, I know that I know, for example, Bishop Morlino in Madison, Wisconsin, he actually had them turn all the altars to be ad orientem. So he didn't change the Novus Ordo, but he just had all the altars go ad orientem. I think one thing would just be just to have an odd-oriented mass that's done with piety and smoke. No, but I mean, just that alone. I remember one day after my first mass back home, and then the next day I said the mass at the parish for everybody, and people came up to me and said things like, and it was a complete Novus Ordo mass, and I just said it following the rubrics of the Novus Ordo, right? And people came up to me afterwards and said, "Did you just say the extraordinary form?" Right? Or they would say things like, "I haven't seen a mass like that in 25 years." Right? So I think part of also I sometimes wonder if the current Cardinal Roach, if he's of this mindset. I think he is, right? That if you just do the Novus Ordo with a lot of piety, and you think a little bit about the symbolism of what you're doing, that can satisfy a lot of the needs of the people.
If that's the mindset, then why does the attention seem to only be on the extraordinary form and not abuses in the Novus Ordo, which are like pretty?
Yeah, no, I know, because I think that goes back to the St. Gallen Mafia, which is right that they don't even want. I think ultimately they would say even like a pious Novus Ordo would be bad.
Yeah.
Right. That would just further inculcate people in rigidity and
Mystification.
yeah, excessive mystification.
Mm-hmm.
So that would downplay the role of the community. I think they would use language like that.
Which is different from British, even.
Right.
Is what you'd say.
Right, I think. I mean, I don't know the guy personally, so I don't know him that well. So I can't. But I think also, they're also. Why do you go at so like actually? So what we see here, there's two visions of what's. I think so. Like, the people that promoted Summum Pontificorum, I think their vision was, you let it grow, so that eventually you merge. And now the St. Gallen people, they're saying, if you let it grow, it'll take over. And you can't, so you have to stop them now so that they don't take over. Because you're in a danger of letting them you're like in a moment of letting them get too big. And if you let them get too big, you're going to have so in other words, it's two different problems. The problem of like dancing on the altars and all that kind of stuff, right? That's like so out of control that it's like hard to rein it in without just driving all sorts of people away. So like the attitude there is like, let it die. And just little by little try to change. But so I think from their standpoint, they're saying, well, this is small, and so it's still so small that you can come down on it without driving them away. You can limit it without driving them away. So limit it now, so that it doesn't get to a point where there's nothing you can do. I think that's their strategy. I mean, I'm just trying to say this would be their.
Yeah.
I'm not saying I agree with it. I'm saying I think that's their strategy.
Yeah.
Yes.
Would you mind speaking a bit to Humanae Vitae and kind of the arc that we covered today? Because it seems like that would touch on a lot of things that you mentioned that are valuable to Ratzinger, Council of the Media, in terms of thinking about the church publicly declaring things of morality, going back to the codes and that sort of stuff.
So clearly, like the St. Gallen types, right? They clearly were the people involved in the dissent, or they descend from those who were the open dissenters of Humanae Vitae, right? So the short story of Humanae Vitae is that at the Second Vatican Council, the church studied the issue and said, look, you can go back to ancient Rome, and you can find like graffiti that says stuff like, Christian women don't use pollutions to prevent conception. Or the equivalent of those words in Latin, right? And they don't eliminate the fetus once it has quickened in the womb, right? There's language like that going back to the ancient church. So the church also says, almost all Protestant denominations, not all, but almost all, have adopted birth control and accepted it. We can't because of the ancient tradition and practice. There's this new question of the pill. And just scientifically, we don't know what the pill does yet. whether it works in harmony with natural functions of the body, or whether it doesn't. So we have to study it some more. So we'll set up a commission to study it. So they set up a commission to study it. And we know now, what we didn't know then, which we know now, is that as soon as they set up the commission to study it, at least in the United States, the Rockefeller Foundation and Notre Dame conspired to have these secret conferences every summer to help prepare the church for accepting birth control. And Notre Dame also had several characters who were on this birth control commission that the Pope had set up. That commission is studying it from like 63 to 68. And the commission is leaking to the media. So first of all, the commission was a long time studying the question. From what I understand, Paul VI didn't want to write the encyclical. He was kind of hoping the problem would just go away. He wouldn't have to say anything. But the majority of the commission was in favor of changing the church's teaching on birth control. And they were also leaking to the media that the church was going to change its teaching on birth control. And then at some point, about a year or so before the encyclical came out, Paul VI said, we're not going to change the teaching. And the short story is that he used the reasoning of the majority, but the conclusion of the minority. So the majority said there's two goods to marriage. There's children and love. And so you can keep your love and not have children. I mean, that's an oversimplification, but you can keep your love and not have children, so therefore there could be instances where you allow for birth control. And then the minority was saying, well, no, the traditional goods of marriage are children, and then a secondary good is love. And so when Paul VI wrote the encyclical, he says, I'm not gonna say which is more important, children or love, but they both have to be present. But a sign of the love is children, so you can't use birth control, right? And so once he came up with that rationale, and once the people on the commission realized he was going to do that, they came to the United States, and they basically organized a bunch of theologians and priests and whatnot, hundreds of them, so as to come out with a protest letter in the New York Times. And McCarrick signed that. The famous McCarrick signed that. All sorts of people signed it. And now Ratzinger himself said in one of his posthumous writings, I think in one of his emeritus writings, I think he said he felt that Humanae Vitae could have been handled better, that it was too scholastic in the way it was written, that it could. So in other words, he feels that. So again, it's a classic example of where he feels it could have been kind of said in better terms, put in a better context, not denying the teachings, right? But then it's obviously, so effectively, in the late 60s to the present, in the U.S., I would say many theologians consider themselves dissenters. Or they will, if they're not dissenters, they will not defend the teaching. They will go silent. They'll teach it, but they'll be silent in teaching it. Now, like in my Catholic high school, they just taught us all how to use birth control.
Same.
Right? So in other words, there's a defiance against the teaching that has descended down to many environments in the United States. And I think in many European countries it's the same. So you have a minority, you probably have 10 to 15% that don't use birth control at this point. Even in Catholic circles. And but I think that comes from that's not just the counsel of the media. That's the kind of more naturalist theologians and bishops and cardinals even who think there should be some fundamental things that change. And they're more than happy on that issue and others just to let the media hammer the church.
Father, just really quickly, is it possible for you to elaborate a little on the point that you made just before about, you talked about concilium, you also talked now about sort of the excesses of scholasticism. I wonder...
Where's Jos when we need him?
within the context of Ratzinger, when he leaves concilium with de Lubac, with what's his face, von Balthasar, and they come and found the Communio Journal. Okay, can you elaborate a little more about what the significance of that was?
Yeah, because he himself says, you can find this going back to the 80s, where in interviews he will say that he thought that he was trying to be faithful to all of the Church's teachings in faith and morals, as presented by the tradition. Only he was trying to find new ways, again, sometimes using the fathers of the Church or other theologians, right? New ways of contextualizing it, explaining it, defending it. And so he thought during the Second Vatican Council that, like when he was working with Hans Kung or John Courtney Murray or the other people along those lines, he thought that they were working in this spirit as well. But then when Humanae Vitae came out, like for him, Humanae Vitae was the eye-opening event. And he thought, wait a second, these people are not trying to explain and further understand the mysteries of Christianity. They're trying to basically say, they're trying to undo the teachings of the Church in several areas. And that we can't do that. That's not what we're about. And so that's where he broke off with these, he and these others, that's why they started Communio, to try to remain committed to this theological task of, given the dispositions of modern man and who you think modern man is, what are the resources that you can use to do apologetics with modern man? And also, what are the resources that you can use that might become fruitful for acquiring a deeper, a further insight into the mysteries of the Blessed Trinity, of the divinity of Christ. I mean, there could be, right? Obviously, there's, from a theological standpoint, there could be a further way, always, we gain insight into the divine mysteries, because they are mysteries. Whereas I think he felt that the concilium people, again, I think he felt that they were limiting the sense of mystery of the faith also. So it wasn't just that they were dissenting from the faith. It's that their approaches were maybe like too naturalist, too materialist. They gave too much to naturalism or materialism or scientism or whatever approach that actually limited our capacity to enter into the mysteries.
Thank you, Father.
You're welcome. I do have to go, actually. I have to go preach.
Yes. Well, thank you so very much.
You're welcome.
For your time and for your